The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
A wrong note becomes a right note depending on the note that follows it. That second note acclimatizes the first note. It gives it a home, a context, a place to lay its head. And you could look at it another way, that a wrong note, or what we might describe as discord, is only ever wrong when that note stops moving.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Joshua Stamper is a composer and collaborator on projects that cross genres and disciplines, from jazz, classical, and avant-garde music to film, dance, visual art, and poetry. He even collaborates with architects. He's in the middle of a hugely ambitious project he calls Elements. It explores new and different relationships between disciplines. What happens, he asks, when choir becomes sculpture, space becomes instrument, architecture responds to touch, when the movement of dancers changes the music they are dancing to? Most importantly, what do these possibilities suggest about how we might live alongside one another? I was thrilled when Joshua Stamper agreed to discuss these ideas with me for this episode of the Habit Podcast. Joshua Stamper, I'm very happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. Thanks for being here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So, how do you describe you're a composer, but you also do these installations? Is that fair to say? Or how do you describe what is your art form?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I'm primarily a composer, but I am. Well, ever since I started writing music and studying more formally, I was always drawn towards the relationships between, or sort of maybe the edges or the margins between different genres of music, and what happens when you bring these two discrete forms of classical and jazz, for example, when you bring them into closer proximity, what kind of static electricity starts to be created, and that's as I've gone through the years, that interest has expanded to more and more different types of music, and then to more and more types of artistic disciplines. And then beyond that, now I'm in a place where where there's a pretty robust dialogue with all kinds of different academic disciplines as well. So
yeah, I used the word installations. Is that even true? Is that even correct, or did I misspeak?
Well, no. I mean, I think that's an interesting word. I think that there is. There's in the work that I'm doing. There's certainly a performance element to it, but there are all these other components that are often at play, and different ways for audiences to engage. So
yeah. Well, let's talk about this. Your project that you're, I guess, kind of in the middle of, Elements. This four part transdisciplinary series, as you call it, and my familiarity with it is just from your website, and it's kind of hard to get a grasp on what you're even up to from that. It feels like something that you need to experience, and the website isn't. It looks fascinating, and I just can't quite get my head around it. So could you just tell me what Elements
for sure
is? Yeah.
It is a lot to try to boil down in the frame of a website doesn't quite accommodate what its scope. But yeah, it's a 4-part series where each part is looking at the 4 classical elements, one of the 4 classical elements, water, air, fire, and earth, and how those are manifest inside of Philadelphia history and culture. I've been living in Greater Philadelphia for the past 15 years, and it's looking at the ways in which each of those elements represents both the necessary conditions, or contributes to is absolutely essential to the thriving of human beings, and at the same time represents a pretty serious liability to the thriving of human beings. And so for example, the first part is hinged to water, and that is looking at the Schuylkill and the Delaware rivers, which border Philadelphia, and the really complex relationship that those rivers had throughout Philadelphia's history to the city itself. The way that the rivers created community, separated community, both human and non-human community. So as an example, and then the second chapter is about air, and looking at that's also looking at text and word, and the sort of our relationship to our own texts, and those texts being kind of always in motion. And then the one that I'm working on right now is about fire, and the relationship between fire and the city is really, really remarkable, and in fire as both a constructive force, but a destructive fact, that it is both of those things at the same time. And then earth, there's a prototype that I'm working with that involves I'm working with actually for both fire and earth. I'm in collaboration with an architecture team that's based in Philadelphia. The firm is called Kieran Timberlake. Incredibly brilliant people. And for earth, we've created the beginnings of a new instrument that's made out of terracotta, that explores all kinds of themes around home and what it means to create home and new sounds, and earth, terracotta actually means burnt earth, which is an interesting thing.
It means burnt earth, you said?
It does.
Yeah. I don't know. I thought it was funny that you felt the need to invent your own instrument for this thing. But one thing you're doing. I was looking at the fire the fire chapter of elements, and saw that you're doing something with hyperlinks. So somehow, could you help me understand that? Somehow the musicians who are playing this composition what does the hyperlinking have to do? You said something, it says something like this is a work for tablet, hyperlink, and quartet or something. I can't remember the specifics.
Right.
So tell me about that, how
sure.
that works. It's so interesting.
Yeah. So yes, the pieces for tablet, hyperlinks, string quartet, and percussion sextet.
Yeah.
And the way that the score works, it doesn't operate like a traditional score, which reads first page to last page, left to right. Every musician is reading off of their music off of tablets, which increasingly is the way that musicians are working.
Mm-hmm.
But on each page of each musician's music, there are these collections of links.
Mm-hmm.
And when a musician, let's say the cellist, for example, when they get to measure 14, they encounter 5 different links, for example. And they can click on any one of those 5 links, and that will shoot them to a different part of the score. And each musician is encountering the same kind of thing on their own music, and the links for each musician they're placed in different places according to phrase endings or phrase beginnings. And so what ends up happening throughout the course of a performance is that all 10 musicians end up taking independent routes through the master score. And so each performance is completely unique to that moment. It's the piece is it is a piece, but it's a completely different piece with each performance. Every performance is a premiere. So,
yeah. I just find that so interesting, and the way I think and talk about art making, I spend a lot of time on the idea of creating order out of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what's your relationship to order and chaos. Because on the one hand, you just described something that sounds a tad chaotic, at least,
right.
But chaotic's not really the right word. It's complex. It's contingent, right? It's not.
Sure.
One thing leads to another, kind of in the way that human interactions are complex and contingent.
Yes.
So tell me about that. You seem to
I so appreciate
complexity than maybe I would be.
I really appreciate that distinction. And you're right. The idea that art is making order out of chaos, that idea doesn't feel quite right to me. That it feels kind of like trying to tame the sea.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond my powers, certainly above my pay grade, and also, honestly, the notion feels a bit presumptuous, hubristic, and disconnected with reality. It's sort of like Don Quixote charging at windmills, and to that point, it makes art fundamentally. I think it makes it fundamentally about conquest, where the relationship between order and chaos is inherently antagonistic, and that the charge of the artist is to vanquish chaos and plant the flag of order, where I must conquer the thing that I don't understand or that I can't control. And none of that appeals to me. It's in part because I think it's inconsistent with what I observe in the world, as you say, in human interaction, and certainly in the natural world, and with who I understand and experience God to be. And I think that so many things that we diagnose as chaotic are in actuality ordered systems that are simply too complex for us to understand, that the order in operation, it eludes our faculties. And so instead, I think that art, for me, is much more about trying to understand something on its own terms, where there's a watching and a waiting and a seeing what emerges, and seeking to, that the art making is that it's a humble attempt to create frameworks that accommodate contradiction and complexity. So for me, the fruits of this kind of approach include a recalibrated sense of scale, where I'm put in my place. I better understand both my own smallness and my own grandeur as a human being made by an untamable God.
Yeah.
So it's not about bringing order out of chaos. Chaos and complexity aren't threats. They're more conversation partners. And there's even an invitation to apprentice with chaos and participate with it, if that makes any sense.
Can you say one more sentence about apprenticing with chaos?
Sure. I think so. I'm a huge fan of Ellen Davis, who's an OT prof at Duke, and she talks about, in the first chapter of Genesis, and the command to human beings to exercise dominion. That phrase, particularly in our current context, feels intensely problematic. But she points out that the phrase is better rendered exercise skilled mastery. And that's predicated on an understanding of how each part exists within the broader whole, an attunement to what each part needs to thrive, and to really bring, which changes sort of your posture towards the rest of the world and towards each other. That there is a study. There's a really sort of intense amount of attention being devoted to this thing that we're supposed to steward, where it really ultimately is much more about careful gardening than doing whatever we want with something. And so I think that those kinds of notions have more to do with what I mean by apprenticing. That it's really paying attention to the way that the world is created, the way that human beings are created, and these things that seem like places of instability or lack of control. Very often, I think it has a lot more to do with the frames that we're working with are just inadequate to really understand those things as being anything other than scary. But actually, back to the notion of walking. I mean, I was saying that with walking, it's a human activity that's so common to the human experience that the word pedestrian has come to mean ordinary, nothing worth taking note of, run of the mill, even boring.
Right.
We walk to work, we walk to school, we walk for leisure, for exercise, we walk together, we walk alone, we walk to pray or unwind. And yet, at its most fundamental level, it's a death-defying, or at least injury-defying activity. Because what is walking if not perpetual falling? The only thing that's keeping me from toppling headlong is that second leg that catches the fall that was created by the first leg.
Yeah.
And then that first leg, or that second leg, turns and becomes a traitor, because it then thrusts me forward into another free fall. Right. And so there's this kind of notion where that instability, which often just feels really, really scary to us, is the very thing that creates motion, that makes us possible to be in relationship with the world and with one another. And so, so all of that to say that I think that this kind of really close study of those things that feel out of our control, and trying to understand the way that those things are really central to the way that the universe is constructed, is really, really important. And I mean, even the way that music functions it's predicated on instability. That's how music does what it does. That's the reason why one chord leads to another, is it has to do with instability. Or you think about the way that a galaxy is constructed, for example, it's all spinning around this kind of central hub of a black hole, which feels about as chaotic as you could get. But,
right.
So it's that kind of thing. I think that I think
orbit
really
is falling, isn't it? I mean, from what I understand about orbit,
right.
Just a constant falling but you're also moving forward enough that you, I don't understand these things enough to even talk about it, but
sure.
But, orbit is falling.
I mean,
and walking, as you said, is just a matter of disequilibrium, putting yourself in a disequilibrium and then catching yourself before you fall on your face.
Right.
It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
The first I knew of you was from a talk that Ruth Naomi Floyd gave earlier this year, and her talk was about dissonance, discord, some of these issues, and she cited you, and she made a strong distinction, which again I think she was borrowing from you. I say borrowing. I know you didn't invent it either, but the idea of that discord and dissonance aren't the same thing.
That's right.
And I'd love to hear you talk about that. I mean, you kind of already have started down that path a little bit, it seems like.
Sure. Yeah. They are not synonyms in my mind. And to draw a distinction, I don't think is semantic fussiness. Discord is all jar and clash and contention and incompatibility. Dissonance is fundamentally about motion, and where you can have dissonance that includes occasions of discord, but it's never just that. Dissonance is always moving somewhere. It's the sawing off of the corner of a square so that it rolls. It's the push of a swing or the crest of a wave. That it's fundamentally about motion. And I'm sort of reminded of Thelonious Monk. He has just a book of incredible quips that have been attributed to him. But one of the things that he has said is that there are no wrong notes. And and maybe that's just it, that a wrong note becomes a right note depending on the note that follows it. That second note acclimatizes the first note. It gives it a home, a context, a place to lay its head.
Yeah.
And you could look at it another way, that a wrong note, or what we might describe as discord, is only ever wrong when that note stops moving, when it sort of decides that it's irredeemable. So in that way, discord is an event, while dissonance is passage. Dissonance is the sort of ever unfolding story of the accommodation of contradiction. And so that's some of how I think about those distinctions. And again, that I really, I mean, there's music isn't certainly not the only place where dissonance is how instability is leveraged. But it's the medium that I know best.
Right.
And there are all kinds of dissonance. There's harmonic dissonance, melodic, intervallic, rhythmic, timbral, structural. And so you take like a Max Roach drum fill, for example, and that's an example of rhythmic dissonance. It's the upset of a pattern and the introduction of instability, which propels the music to beat one of the next measure. And there's so many different types of dissonance that we could talk about.
Well, I know you're interested in city life, in the history of Philadelphia and the present, the city planning, all these issues. And I love that idea that discord is a as you said, discord is an event, dissonance is a passage, and discord is discord that thinks of itself as irredeemable.
Right.
And that seems pretty relevant to the life of a city as people come into conflict, as people come into as people with different backgrounds, interests, values come into conflict with one another. Is that a dissonance that's going to move toward something, or is that a discord that gives up on itself as irredeemable? Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's we're living in a moment that's where that question is the stakes are pretty high, in terms of how we answer that question. And I think that is really the social implications of the question are pretty intense. And I do think that's a decision that each individual in each community needs to make. Are you willing to are you willing to live with the discomfort of instability? Are you willing to sort of live in or are you willing to create frames that accommodate the instability that's inherent in something like walking, for example? That there is a kind of free fall ingredient to any kind of constructive dialogue, where listening to another person involves learning where they're actually coming from, as opposed to deciding ahead of time where they're actually coming from. And that seems really, really critical to any kind of constructive dialogue.
But I think there's a lot of hope baked into this idea of dissonance as a passage, as a movement towards something.
Yeah. It does feel like a more hopeful way of looking at the world and neighbor and God and yourself.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Can we change the subject to? I was really interested in something you wrote about John Cage's work. Do you say 4:33, or do you say 4 minutes and 33 seconds when you talk about that work?
I always say 4 minutes and 33 seconds. But
okay.
Yeah.
4 minutes. Yeah. A work that you said people have often thought of as sort of a prankish. This is the work where the pianist sits down at the bench for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and then leaves. And you sort of write
right, without playing a note.
Without playing a note, yes.
Right.
And you have written a short defense of that work, and you say that it changed your way of thinking about. You said you haven't heard things the same since an encounter with that work. You said it all becomes music.
That's right.
Could you talk about that a little bit? I'd love to hear.
Of course, yeah. I think that Cage's work sort of writ large, and I think a lot of modern art, modern music, for lots of folks really feels alienating and militantly so. And my initial experiences of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, I too felt that way, that it just felt condescending. It felt like a middle finger to the audience, you know? And that it's interesting. This ties into what we've been talking about already. That my view of that piece really was turned on its head when I encountered a different piece of John Cage, where it was this televised show of where you see him. You know, he's built this huge kind of Rube Goldberg sort of musical instrument / performance, and the way that he talks about it in the introduction, and the way that he performs it, it completely changed my understanding of who he was, and that rather than being somebody that was a prankster with an overinflated sense of his own importance, I encountered somebody that was filled with wonder and playful, that just reveled in the sheer fact of sound, and that in turn completely changed the way that I heard 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That it was no longer a giant middle finger to the audience, but it was this capacious invitation to lean in, to listen close, to see what happens next. And the 4 minutes and 33 seconds just becomes the frame in which you listen to everything that's going on, and that everything that is within that frame becomes the piece, whether that's the crinkling of candy wrappers or whether that's car horns in the background or whatever, that there's a certain kind of sense in which you're focusing on those sounds that sort of recede into the background, and for us most of the time actually become forefronted, and we listen to them in a new way. And through that experience, it sort of, I think, dawned on me that the composer or the artist or the writer, their own life becomes the most sort of the greatest and most accurate interpretive lens through which to understand their work. And which again, I think gets back to this broader, question about how do we interact with each other, and are we taking the time to listen, to understand who the other is as an interpretive, as a way of finding an interpretive rubric to understand what they're actually saying. About a month and a half ago, I came across this little thing I had never noticed before in Luke, and where Jesus says, "Pay attention to how you listen," which is such a curious phrase. That there's hearing is certainly not an activity that's guaranteed by the existence of ears. There is a skill involved in hearing, and that's a skill that can be strengthened over time. And that's a skill that, it doesn't just happen, is what I'm trying to say. something that needs to be cultivated. And when you think about the training of a musician, for example, there's just years and years and years that's devoted to, and not that this ever stops, but so much of the work of being a musician is devoted to learning how to hear, just like so much of the work of an artist is devoted to learning how to see.
Yeah.
It doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
So
there are so many ways that our brain fills in gaps that that sometimes it feels like a large part of the artist's work is to, instead of letting their brain fill in the gaps, to see the gaps or to see what's actually there. Think about
absolutely
a photographer. When I look through a viewfinder of a camera, and there's a shadow that cuts directly across the frame, I don't notice it because I'm not a photographer, and I don't pay. My brain fills in, and I don't notice there's a shadow there because of the way my brain has filled things in. Whereas the photographer sees it and knows what to do about it, knows what to make of it, whether that's to use that shadow or to reframe so they don't have the shadow. Or
completely agree.
As I was reading what you wrote about John Cage, I sort of thought about we are trained to, or not trained, one way or another we ignore the candy wrapper, or we're annoyed by the candy wrapper, or our fellow congregant who's coughing or whatever, right, instead of doing something with it.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, my brother he's a really remarkable filmmaker, but I think part of the reason why he's a really remarkable filmmaker is that all of his training was as a painter, visual artist, and he's also an extraordinary painter. But years and years ago, we were driving around, and it was rainy, and I asked him, so when you talk about learning how to see, what does that mean to you? And he said, okay, so for example, we're driving around. What color is the road right now? I said, well, it's gray. And he said, no, it's not gray. Look at it more closely. And as you do, I mean, you start to see, oh, actually there's blues, and there's yellow, and there's a little bit of red, and there's all of these things that kind of come into view as you begin to really focus on something. And I'm reminded of Mary Oliver talking about, she says, to pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. And that work of attention, of really, really noticing, of understanding all of the composites that make the whole, is just so important. And I think so much of the work that's involved in art making it really has to do with that, of noticing, all the things that our brain sort of automatically synthesizes to mean one thing, but can we actually backtrack and look at all the parts, and can that one thing actually mean something different?
That's so good.
So I think it is interesting how all this sort of ties together. All these themes are interwoven and connected.
Yeah. All right. One last topic. That is, in one of your pieces, again, on one of your short little pieces on your website, you talk about something that the artist Ann Hamilton said about an installation that I guess somewhere in New York City, I think, anyway. And she said, she remarked, it happened because a space was made to make it happen. And right. She was, I think specifically talking about somebody with some authority in the city, made a space for her to make this piece of art. And yet you have said that's become your working manifesto, that things happen when you make space to make them happen. This is a podcast for people who make art. And so I'd love to hear you talk about what it means to make space to make art happen.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is, certainly in my own experience, it's not the crush of life and all of the responsibilities and all the sort of day-to-day coming and going. That there is an intention that needs to be brought to bear if you're wanting to make art. And I think there is something really, really critical about creating literal and temporal space for art making.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even in the way that you are approaching all of the coming and going and all the interruptions and mm-hmm. Are those things slotting into this larger kind of way of trying to understand, back to the theme of chaos, trying to understand the chaos of our everyday. And so there's, in terms of space, there's also, I think, a necessary cognitive framing, that's involved in how are we interpreting the day-to-day. And I don't think that creative work is only for those that have the time or the money mm-hmm. or are in the life stage to be able to have just sort of an idyllic studio in the woods to write or to or compose or to paint. But I do think that those kinds of spaces do need to be protected.
I'm sorry, which kind of spaces? Are you saying temporal and physical space need to be protected, or are you talking
temporal,
about
physical, and cognitive space?
Cognitive space.
And spiritual space, that there is trying to take stock of what are the things in my life that impede attention, that sort of work that Mary Oliver talks about. For me, the list is long of things that call for attention, and so if I start looking at my day-to-day through that lens of all of the things that demand my attention,
mm-hmm.
then there are choices that are there to be made, and every choice is a renunciation. So whatever I say yes to, that means I'm saying no to other things. And if whatever I say no to means a yes to something else. So bringing that kind of framing to the days. Everybody has, we all have our to-do lists, but there are all these little kind of pockets of time and attention that, we either decide to do something with it or it's decided what we do with it by somebody else, or something else. And so I think that's part of what I mean by creating protections around.
I love that idea of protecting cognitive space, and perhaps redeeming cognitive space by saying, again, this candy wrapper that's rattling over here, I can be annoyed, or I can ignore it, or I can pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have choices there.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a really wonderful documentary called Touch the Sound that I would highly recommend.
Okay.
It's about a percussionist named Evelyn Glennie, who phenomenal percussionist, but she also happens to be profoundly deaf, and she began to lose her hearing when she in early adolescence, and had the really good fortune of having a music teacher that was sort of walking with her through that process. And so he would have her stand at the other end of the music room, and he'd play like middle C, for example, on the piano, and he would say, "Okay, where do you feel that?" And she would like point to her wrist and see, I kind of feel it right around here. And then he basically did that through the whole range of the piano, and she learned to map sound all over her body. And
that's amazing.
It is amazing. And what's fascinating is it really turns on its head what it means to perceive sound. There's this one point where she talks about how you hear with your ears, I hear with my entire body. So which one of us hears better? And I raised that just to talk about how I emerged from that watching that documentary the same way that once my understanding of John Cage was reframed, I listened to everything differently. That there is this kind of every sound that happens is an invitation to pay attention, and it does reframe how you think about interruption and distraction and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's this sort of like cognitive jujitsu that ends up happening. If that makes any sense.
Well, I appreciate this reminder to treat everything as an invitation to pay attention. Flannery O'Connor said, the writer shouldn't be afraid to stare because everything is worthy of a writer's attention. And
that's beautiful. Yeah,
so
I like that a lot.
I'm hearing some of these same things from you. So maybe we better wrap it up there. But Joshua Stamper, thank you so much for being here. This has been just great to hear your thoughts about some things I just don't spend any time thinking about. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the invite. It's been really fun.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.